My name is Dr. Eric Thomas Weber. I'm from the Department of Public Policy Leadership, and I have been working on issues of ethics, justice, leadership, and I have focused on Mississippi. And as I was finishing my latest project, I was deeply dismayed by what we all learned in about a racially motivated murder in Jackson. And it was deeply troubling, but also offered opportunity for us to think and reflect about what Mississippi's about today. And I'm very pleased to have learned about Judge Reeves and about his judgment in the case. He is known, among other things, for a speech that he gave at the sentencing of the murders. Judge Reeves attended Jackson State University for his undergraduate degree, and then was in law school at the University of Virginia. He has worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office, in private practice, and now in the federal U.S. District Court. And so I do need to note some thanks to the university, to my department, Public Policy Leadership, to the Dean's Office and the College of Liberal Arts. I'm grateful for their support as well. And then the Mississippi Humanities Council very generously gave us a grant to support putting on this event today. I'm very glad you all are here. Thank you so much. I do need to make one point, which is at the end of this presentation, I would ask that you please fill out an evaluation form, which is for the grant. So it's simple, it's quick. I'm going to pass these out now. And if anybody comes in as we're going, please ask them to fill that out before you leave. I've got some pens here as well, if folks didn't bring a pen. So I think both of us project pretty well, but I've also got a microphone. I think we should probably use it, and I'll hand it to Judge Reeves. But what I thought we might do is to begin just with some big picture questions. And since we're here to talk about race and moral leadership in the U.S. judicial system, I thought I would invite Judge Reeves to tell us about what he learned in coming to this case that was such a big deal in Jackson, and what he found startling about it, what he thought were the obligations of moral leadership in the context of this difficult racial moment. So why don't we begin, though, by thanking Judge Reeves for coming today.
Thank you, Professor Weber. Can you hear me fine? For the invitation to come up. I think it's dynamic that he would put together something that causes us to talk and have a conversation. And that's how we can get to that next point wherever we decide to go. It's through conversation, it's through being with each other, it's through talking to one another. The only thing that I would ask that you do is make sure that you mark 5 or excellent or superb on not on everything, but it's truly an honor to be invited to the University of Mississippi. We know the historic legacy, historic baggage, if you will, that the university carries, but we also know how over the last generation, because I was a student at Jackson State in the 1980s, when the big controversy on this campus was whether, I think his name is Steve Hawkins, it may not be Hawkins, it was the Chili, whether he would have to carry the rebel flag with him during, I guess it was after every touchdown where they ran the rebel flag, and it was the rebel flag then, I do believe, around the football field. And I understand the university has been really moving toward a new university, really trying to make sure that that is a part of its past. And of course, the past, as always, the past always seems to reverberate everywhere, not just at the University of Mississippi. As I was telling a group of students this morning at the University of Virginia, when I was in law school there, I went to law school. I didn't tell them this part, but when I was applying to law school, I wanted to go to a school on the East Coast, near the DC area, on the East Coast. Coming from Mississippi, that was the East Coast. But when I got to the campus, and as I walked around, I saw a statue of Stonewall Jackson. And I said, I'm back home. That's not the East Coast. So Virginia, coming from my mind, it was on the East Coast, but obviously it's the cradle of the Confederacy as well. And the University of Virginia, in 1986, 87, 88, 89, was having its own issues, its own struggles with the quote unquote, with the race issue. I kept some articles from back then, and I was reminded that, one of the things that they had that a group of us felt so not objectionable to, but we said, you guys are where some of us were years ago, because they had at that time, they were really struggling, and they had a task force on Afro-American affairs. So they had not even made it to African American at that time, and that was in 1986. So again, it is an honor and a privilege to be invited to the University of Mississippi. You all have read, and to some degree, that case is still open. There is a matter of restitution that the court will have to hear. But you've seen the statement. And if I can say anything about the statement, I'll just say this. It was, I knew for a long time that the statement, that something was going to be said. Put a lot of thought into it. The young man pled guilty long before they were sentenced. So you did have time to think about all the things that you thought were necessary and important. And to those people who say poo-poo on the idea of majoring in philosophy or history or political science or government, say poo-poo back, because I majored in political science. And as I told a group earlier, history was a real component also of what I was doing. The electives that I took were mostly in the history department. So I like to believe that I had a concept of history and thinking about that. And as I thought about those things, and as I know, going back to law school, there was a study group of us coming from different areas, different backgrounds. One was a guy in accounting, one was economics. Two of us were political science and history. And when you read cases and when you analyze cases, you're going to analyze them from your point of view. If it's accounting, you're looking at business, money, and things of that sort. If it's law and economics, you're looking at the economic ramifications of things. Well, I sort of looked at things from a historical perspective, from a political science sort of perspective. So I knew when I drew this case, I knew it was important for me at least, and I wondered and debated about, well, what do we do? And so I thought about it for months. These guys had pled guilty months and even years, I think, before they were actually sentenced. They had been arrested. They'd have been at least 18 months or so. So you did have an opportunity to think about these things. The type of crime, though, was one that spoke to not just these individuals. And when you thought about who these individuals were, you thought about what year this was, 2000, 2014, 2015, murders having occurred in 2012. You thought about those children. And yes, they are and they were children. What would propel a child, group think, group dynamic, whatever, what would compel them to do this? So I knew it was important when thinking about doing this, it was important to also think about what audience might hear this. Of course, when sitting down writing this and thinking about what's going to be done, the audience obviously are the defendants and the victim's family. We know that. We know that there will be family members to support the victim, and we know there will be family members there to support the defendants. Well, in this instance here, there was a much wider audience I came to learn. Obviously, I knew people would be in the courtroom, and frankly, I thought the attention of the local media would be more than what it was, not thinking about the national media might pick up on it as well. So I knew that there would be an audience, and I knew there were some things that we had to talk about, some things that you had to think about, because this was an extremely horrendous crime, no doubt about it. It was not a one-off crime either. And in my second statement that was read to the other people, I made that point much more clear, because I thought that the letters that I got in support of the young men and from what I then learned of others, people saw this as one crime. That there was one night, these kids got together, they decided to do this, and this happened. The facts of this matter, however, show this was not a one-night event. There were other victims who could not be identified, who were hurt, who were beaten, but they were never identified. They never came forward. We know they were indeed victims because the defendants told the prosecutors about the number of times that they had gone out. And the only thing that happened on this night was that it culminated in a death. And so you have to peel all of that back, and you have to think about what is it that could propel these young kids to do this, and then what reaction there is for those who know them, for those who love them, and for the people in the community who might have been shocked or gassed or whatever. How do you heal that process and move forward? So the statement was one that was thought about for a long time. I read stuff. I went back to old sources of stuff, and the events on that night really mirrored events that occurred, but for the fact that you have cars and other automobiles and stuff like that occurred in Mississippi 100 years ago. So what would prepare this new generation? Because again, these are kids, and I have a daughter who's the same age as some of these children. So do her contemporaries sit around and groupthink to do something like that? I would hope not. Don't know. So what is it? And I thought we had to talk about those things. One of the points that's made in the statement that caused me to sort of respond was a letter that we received on behalf of one of the individuals. That letter talked about one of the victims, one of the individuals, the defendants, being, I'm a member of his church. I am a mentor to him in his church. There are, and this is almost a quote, but it's in the statement. There are a lot of criminals in this state, I believe, or in this world. But this defendant is not one of them. And that said to me a whole lot, because we have someone in a church who now has the evidence of the person having pled guilty. He's pled guilty to a particular crime, because the support letters only come prior to sentencing. So he has pled guilty. What is the notion of a person's view of a criminal? That was the one thought that made me have to ask that question. And what is his caricature? What is his portrait? What is his picture of a criminal if the person has pled guilty to a hate crime that led to the death of an individual? If he is not a criminal, who is? And if he is not a criminal, what is the victim in this case? I mean, is he inanimate? Is he inhuman? So I thought that you had to at least, of the many things that came out in the letters, I thought that statement had to be made, and I was hoping, I don't know if that person was in the courtroom, could have been. I didn't say his name. I mean, we thought about different things. Didn't say the person's name, but I hope that that person heard that, and now I'm hoping that that person thinks about what is his view of a criminal, if there are many out there, but the person is involved in a conspiracy to hurt individuals based on their race. If that person is not a criminal in this supporter's mind, who is? So I thought it was very important to sort of talk about that, to talk about how Mississippi has struggled with its past. And it has, it's struggled mightily. But Mississippi has also struggled to move forward. No better example than what has occurred here over the last several weeks, what has occurred here over the last several years. Trying to turn that corner to make sure that, yes, love, respect, honor James Meredith, but it's 2015 now, and there's a new University of Mississippi. There's a new Mississippi, I believe. And that's what my mission has been, sort of, because I claim Mississippi. And if you read the statement, that's there too. Mississippi is mine. Mississippi belongs to me. I was born in here in Fort Hood, Texas, but I'm from Yazoo City. And I tell everybody that. And people joke with me, boy, you're so proud of Yazoo City. I say, yes, I am. I'm from Mississippi. Mississippi is my home. Mississippi is where my parents are from. Mississippi is home. And I claim what Mississippi is and what Mississippi ought to be. So there was a question that we raised in that thing. In other words, it's a new Mississippi, and I'm not going, and if I have any power over it, I'm not going to allow anybody to take my Mississippi from me and make it whatever they want their Mississippi to be. And I think we all have that obligation, those who love the state as I do. And I can love the state because this is my state. And we all can love the state because this is your state. And so those dynamics are the things that I wanted to share. And I wanted those young men, and I had the young men. Again, I sentenced about 6 of them. Judge Wingate had 4 of them, I believe, 2 of whom were young ladies. So, So I thought it was necessary, again, to speak to them. And also now, they are criminal defendants, they're going to jail. We send a lot of people to jail every day, every week, most of whom do not look like these young people. And so you have to give them some message of some hope that, yes, this too shall pass. It may take a lot of years for them to serve their sentences, but they're going to come back home to the people who love them, to the places where they can go, your family's gone. Most of the time, your family is going to welcome you back when nobody else will. So they're gonna return to society just like every other criminal defendant. Unless you die in prison, the chances are you will get out and you will likely go back to the community where you came from. Because very few others going to want to be around you, associate with you. So I thought it was powerful to also, I don't wish ill harm on those young men. You want them to find peace, and that's how we close the statement. We hope they find peace as well, because you do want, they're going to have struggles inside of the prison. BOP. And I tell criminal defendants, and I tell non-criminal defendants, I tell students this all the time. Before you go off and do something like that or anything else, think about putting your life in the hands of others who don't care about you, who have no right to care about you, who have no right to love you, who have no right to treat you well. They have rules that they ought to obey, but they have no right and no obligation to show you love. If you're up there in the Bureau of Prison, they could turn a blind eye to your hurt, your pain, and your agony. Why would you put your life in the hands of those who don't care about you, those who love you? So those are the messages, and I know we went through statistics in that thing, and we sort of tied together because, again, my Mississippi has a tortured history of lynching and everything else. And we have not generally, unless you're in somebody's history class, and unless you're somewhere else, you really haven't talked about it, you really haven't studied it, and all that. So this was an opportunity to talk about that as well. And I'm so sorry, that was a very long opening statement. I'm sorry.
That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. I'll follow up if you'll continue to stand. I think you might just go on with the question of what do you think are prospects for unity in Mississippi? As someone trying to contribute to moral leadership in the ways that we've talked about. In particular, I think the challenge we've discussed already might be worth returning to about the matter of whether or not a judge should speak up. Whether or not a judge should make declarations, and would you speak about the different debates about that and how you feel about the issue?
Yeah, I think judges have a unique role. First of all, they've already proven that they're leaders in some way. Whether you've been elected or appointed, you've prepared yourself to lead in some way, to lead in winning that election, or by lead. Very few judges have not held some leadership role in their life. So they've come prepared to lead in a way that others might not choose to or not capable of doing or whatever. But judges, by their nature, I think, by their training, by their experiences, have all been leaders. And I'm of the philosophy that, judges are human too. Just because you put on a robe does not mean that you lose your humanity. You don't lose who you are. You don't lose where you came from. You don't lose those things that have created you, whether it's education, whether it's religion, whether it's what it's socioeconomic. You don't lose that just because you put on a robe, in my view. So So judges, obviously the canons restrict what we can say, when we can say it, and all that. But when you have the opportunity to say things, I think that you should. And whether it's in the educational realm, whether it's, you probably can't talk much about policy and probably can't, but there may be an opportunity where there's a case that you have that will allow you to engage in the political discussion, the policy sort of discussion, and things that you normally might not be able to say things about. So I think judges ought to take those opportunities to shed light, to inform, to educate. In each of our opinions that we write, for example, you always think about who is your audience. And sometimes you write directly to the parties, because that's the only somebody who really cares about that particular matter. I slipped and I fell in the grocery store. I'm supposed to be paid. The grocery store says, no, there was no water on the floor because we had wiped it up 10 minutes before. And now that we went back and inspected. So now when it's time to talk about whether this person here claims should go forward, you sort of, is this something that for these parties, or does it require something else? Well, there may be a big policy issue before you. There may be something, say for example, marriage equality. There may be something there that speaks to more than just the parties before you. Because the question is now whether same-sex couples can be married. Same-sex couple A and B are before me, but if whatever ruling that I make, it applies to same-sex couples all over Mississippi. So in that context, who is the audience that you could choose to write to those just to the parties before you. But in that instance, it might be okay, it might be appropriate to write a bigger picture, to talk about things that were raised or could have been raised or were not raised and all that kind of thing. And again, talk about policy, talk about other types of things. Obviously, talk about the law in all of this. But you always think in your opinions, who is the audience? Who am I speaking to? Who should I be speaking to? So that's one thing you do with engaging in that sort of communication. Again, judges are human. You know, they are human. They breathe just like I do. They do other things. You know, they get out their diet just like I do. You know, they work hard like I do. But they're judges. They have families. They have things. And yes, these discussions occur around their tables at home. I know they do. Because sometimes their decisions impact what's going on in their own homes. I mean, the rate increase in Kemper County. I don't even know if that's a lawsuit or not. But of course, anytime a judge is asked to talk or to rule on whether a rate increase is doable or should be, well, obviously, if a rate increase is necessary, his is going to get increased too. So you think about those types of things, and judges, they're different from executive, the gubernatorial type of leader, or the legislative guiding the Congress. But judges are leaders in their own way and in their own role, and actually they should be, in my view. I'm speaking for Carlton Reeves. Somebody, obviously there may be judges, obviously, who disagree with it.
Thank you, Judge. This is meant to be an open forum discussion, so I began with a few questions for the judge. I had hoped to have wireless mics, but somehow I ended up with this. I would ask if you ask a question, please to speak loudly or to come on up and we can use the microphone. Or if you don't feel comfortable with that, we can repeat the question once we hear it. So does anybody have any questions for Judge Reeves?
Not all at once.
Oh, we have a hand.
What do you make of statements like Justice Scalia, for example? I mean, he's kind of the person who's most often making claims against judicial activism, and I guess that's defined very differently. But would you speak to that question? Because I know a lot of times, I mean, every decision has a moral component, even if it's not intended as such. I mean, there's a point of view expressed in it that's beyond just the narrow. I mean, the interpretation of the law, I guess, has its own moral component. But what do you make of, or where do you situate yourself on that continuum of judicial activists and, well, anyway.
It depends on what your definition of activism is and your view of what the law is and what's allowed by you. There are people who read broadly, for example, the 14th Amendment, and, you know, no discrimination based on race, national origin. I mean, you know, so it depends on what your definition of judicial activism, what your definition of judicial restraint. And, you know, your decisions should always be shrouded by, in my view, the Constitution. If the Constitution allows you to breathe life into it, because we know, I do subscribe to the notion that, obviously, I think Thurgood Marshall said it at the bicentennial of the Constitution back in 1989, where he talked about the Declaration and the Constitution itself being infected or you know, from the concept. It was not full and whole and complete when it was authored. It took, as he said, the Civil War. It took amendments to perfect the Constitution. So you look at that sort of thing, but it depends on whose version of activism you're talking about and reading about it. And obviously, you know, every Supreme Court justice or every other judge himself will have their own views about how constrained one ought to be in interpreting the Constitution, and whether you sit down in the shoes and in the clothes of the persons who drafted the language on that given day, and where do you, how do you move from there? If you stay in the 18th century, for example, or do you look beyond what it said then and apply it to what it is now, based on what has happened and transpired and how the world is today? I know that's a long way of not answering your question, but I do think that you know, it depends on how you define activism. I know there are those who would say that the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision, which said that same-sex couples can marry, that the Constitution itself allows for it. I know there are those who say that that's activist and all that, but the judges who wrote the majority opinion pointed to the 14th Amendment, which said gives them that the 14th Amendment says that there shall not be discrimination. You shall treat people equally. So what was equal back in the 1700s obviously was not equal in 1967 when the Loving case was decided. But we know every state, many states in the Union, even my Mississippi, had declared that opposite race couples could not marry, at least black and white. Maybe other races could have, but for sure black and white people could not marry. And that was in 1967. And that was looking back to what the 14th Amendment said when it was enacted approximately 100 years before. So it depends on what your definition of activism is, and it's, as they say, it's, what is it, who's goose getting cooked at the time, whatever the sayings are. I mean, but it depends on who's looking at that word.
Thank you. Any other questions?
You have a very diverse academic career coming from Jackson State to the University of Virginia. And so I was kind of wondering if you could speak on a little bit the differences that you've noticed in how people at an HBCU look at racial injustice and racial violence as opposed to a PWI. Because our frame of reference here is kind of through the lens of a PWI. And so if you could kind of talk about the differences between those two types of institutions.
Yeah, obviously the institutions have different philosophies, different missions, a different dynamic. The greatest decision I made, as I told a group of people earlier, was to go to Jackson State. Had my heart, soul, and everything set on going to USM. But I'll just tell you, thank God for OJ. And you might have to get that from somebody. I drank some orange juice. I flunked a physical test. And therefore, my admittance into USM was delayed on an Air Force ROTC scholarship. So I decided, so when that delay occurred, I went back to the recruiter at Jackson State, Dr. Maria Luisa Alvarez Harvey, Mexican-American woman, who was over the honors program, who was persistent about me coming to Jackson State. She was equally persistent about me majoring in computer science or something like that. And I was like, I have no concept of math. I don't have a strong concept of math and sciences. I don't want to do that. I want to do politics. But she stayed on me. She stayed on me. And when I went to her in August of 1982 and said, this is what has happened at USM, and if I delay any more, I won't be able to come to school. She said, I said, can I still come? She said, sure, come. Your scholarship is still here. And that was one of the best decisions that I made. Now, what was going on at Jackson State at that time? I got an opportunity to learn more about myself, learn about governing, about politics, about myself. I told the group this morning, I was in one of my pre-law political science classes, and the professor looked over at me, knew I was from Yazoo City, and asked me had I read the book Yazoo. And I said, sure I have. I said, sure, yeah. I was thinking it was the book by Harriet Bissell and Joanne Pritchard. Yazoo is Legends and Legacies. That's about the witch of Yazoo City. It didn't give a history of Yazoo City. Gave the witch of Yazoo City, the flood, the great fire, and all of that. It's a big old table book, one of these big things that you put on the table. But I had read it, had done a book report on it in like the 8th or 9th grade, I think. So yeah, and he said, that's not the book I'm talking about. He said, you know Willie Morris? I said, well, yeah. Willie Morris had come to my humanities class when I was in the 10th or 11th grade, possibly 12th grade. But he had come home to Yazoo to talk to our humanities class. I said, yeah, I know Willie Morris. North toward home, good old boy. My dog Skip. Yeah, but you know what? He said, no, have you read his book? Yazoo. I said, no. He brought it the next class period, told me to take it, and told me to read it. And that book was about Yazoo City, the integration of a deep southern town, I believe is its entire name. And it was about Yazoo City integrated in 1970. Now, we all know that Mississippi schools were not forced to integrate until Holmes versus Alexander. In 1969, students went home in 1969 for Christmas, and when they came back, many of them were told to go to different schools. That integration was right now, not all deliberate speed. All deliberate speed means right now. So that was in 1969, 1970, January 1970. And so Morris writes that book, and he talks about how Yazoo City dealt with that. And it opened my eyes because he talked about people who I knew. He named names, he told stories about them, he told things that I didn't know. I knew who I think there's a quote in the book, Jeppy Barber was the mayor then. He was like Yazoo City's youngest mayor. I think he was like early 20s at that time, maybe mid 20s. And there was a remark, according to the book, that he made about some of the police officers who had integrated the police force. I knew those individuals' names were not spoken, but then there were other names that he mentioned. Harold Kelly, at the time, was the superintendent. At the time of the integration, he was probably still superintendent. He had mentioned that name. He had mentioned Mr. Patnott, who owned a local store. But Mr. Patnott, again, didn't know this about Mr. Patnott. Mr. Patnott, I don't want to say in honor, but when Martin Luther King was killed, what Mr. Patnott did is bought a life membership in the NAACP. I learned that in that book. So Dr. Holmes told me to read that. That opened my eyes. And then, as I studied history at Jackson State more, we talked about the race issue. We talked about in our Mississippi history class with Dennis Mitchell, who is mentioned in the first line of that statement that I gave. We talked in his class the day after the March on Washington, the banner head and the Clarion Ledger was something like, the people clean up behind the Negro trash or something like that. So we talked about those sort of things. We talked about those sort of things. And from a historical perspective, and the people who typically go to HBCUs, it's important to understand who you are, understand where you're coming from. And, we do know, and as I told people earlier today, we have seen things and have experienced things that many white people have not experienced, have not seen. We are rising to the top now, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement, which comes out of what we've been able to track on videotape, what we've been able to see and hear that has been recorded, like the young black man who was killed by the officer near Charleston, South Carolina. So we have heard those type of stories before. And now many black people saying, see, we told you so. So you come from that perspective in an HBCU, understanding who you are and where you're coming from, and understanding that you are a product of your environment, where you are and who you are. And I mentioned the integration of the New South sort of thing, because that experience for me, that case came down in December 1969. The schools flipped January 1970. Well, the story that I tell about myself is that in September of 1970, it was my first grade class that started out the first grade as an integrated class. And many of us have stayed in contact and have remained friends over the years. And that in and of itself has shaped me about as much as anything else, because I've had the experience of sitting down with white kids for 12 years, from first grade to 12th grade, knowing that I was as good as the next person next to me, and had friendships, relationships Now, most of the relationships were confined to the school day and the school year, because there were still structural barriers and things like that, well, we just didn't mix over the course of the summer or after 3 o'clock, or unless you were into sports and that way. I mean, but that in and of itself has really been a defining point for me, as opposed to my older brothers and sisters who went through, I guess, segregated schools for a period of time. But for 12 years, I sat next to white students, and I felt like I was equal. We thought we loved each other. By the time we became seniors, that was one of our themes that we always talked about, the fact that we had been together for 12 years. Our class song was Ebony and Ivory. Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney, yeah, Beneath, and that was our class song. It come out that year, and we adopted that as a class song. So those type of experiences, again, at HBCU, and I strongly recommend HBCUs to all African American students. That's just who I am. As a starting point, so that you could get that experience of understanding who you are, where you come from, and then you can go off anyway. And I was prepared to go off to Virginia. I thought a school on the East Coast, maybe Jackson State, should help me bone up on my geography to let me know. Maybe I didn't take history to mean Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy and all that, and not making that general connection. But coming from the very deep South, way up to close to DC, I figured that Virginia was a different place. Now, Jackson State, I could name all the other law schools, which, this is what I say about Jackson State. The students in my 4 years there, who eventually went on to law, in my 4 years, went to some of the best schools in the country and were accepted into some of the best schools in the country, from Harvard to Yale, Georgetown, Vanderbilt, University of Texas, Northwestern. We produced that. We can do that, and we did that. So I think, to better answer your question, I think your viewpoints, your experiences sort of help crystallize how you view and see things. And so we must all be open to receiving knowledge from everyone. And I know that's what the university is currently undergoing, and all of that, debates about everything. But what better place to have real debates than on the college campus? What better place is it? And that's what a college campus has to be: vibrant, and you have to be ready. We have to be able, when we walk away from this place, we have to make sure it's in the hands of people, the next generation, who is going to do something even more profound, even better, who is going to bring Mississippi, or take Mississippi to the next level. And Mississippi is going to have to go to the next level. Whether it goes kicking and screaming is left up to the old people. The new people, though, the young people, are going to have to gracefully take it over. And so I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if that touched on anything, but I said, I'm sorry.
Well, there's another hand here.
Do we have time?
Well, we do.
Okay, cool. So kind of off all of that, off of like setting moral leadership and all that kind of stuff, and kind of off of your cases, the same-sex marriage case, as well as the Anderson case, you've kind of have set a moral standard from your own eyes and from a lot of people across the state. But you've obviously had dissent, like people disagreeing with you. And so, in the past 2 weeks, we've had the same thing where we've tried to set a moral standard through the flag and by taking down our state standard. And so, we've had the issue of dealing with dissent here, where like a lot of us feel like the people who just have disagreed with the flag have been, like I was for taking the flag down, but I feel as though a lot of the people that were for keeping the flag up have been completely alienated now, and they're being kind of hardened by like the conversation, like them feeling like they didn't have enough of a say in the conversation. So how do you, whenever you're pushing for moral leadership that you think to be just, but there are people that are equally as convinced that what they believe in, the heritage argument maybe in this case, that being, how things should be, how do you kind of meet them in the middle, you know what I mean? And accomplish your goals of moral leadership, but also not alienating large swaths of people to the point where you just kind of polarize things more. And does that make sense?
It makes sense, and it's a difficult question because when people believe in what they believe in and they think they're morally, that their beliefs are grounded in some sort of morality, they tend to be rigid, whether it's for and I know you bring it into contemporary times, it's whether you take the flag down or leave the flag up. It's a matter of discussion and debate, and obviously for those who are for taking it down, getting the message across to those who want to leave it up, that it's a symbol of hatred, it's a symbol of hurt, it's a symbol of pain for the person, maybe for the person sitting next to you. And why do you want to hurt the person next to you? And you have to get them to come see, I think you have to get them to see it from that perspective. Some argue, and I argue, I talk to people, it's just a symbol. It's just a flag. But that's the very point. It is a symbol. Symbols have meaning, just like words have power. Symbols have meaning. Symbols do. Then why do we drape a dead soldier in we tie up the American flag and we give it to the grieving widow, the grieving widower, the wife, the husband, the family? That's a big symbol. And we cherish our symbols. Another symbol that we have is the cross, right? People wear crosses around their neck. And I remember, again, when I first became a law clerk, so this must have been 1989 or 1990, Robert Mapplethorpe, is that his name? That had the thing called Piss Christ, I think, the cross inside of a bottle of urine that's stirred up all the emotions. Symbols mean things to people, and we have to understand, you have to convince others of, again, acknowledging the history. And I don't thought, I may have told the class this earlier, one of the things that we've lost in our educational system with trying to strive to get better, focusing on science and math as they ought to be focused on, because the world has changed. But in doing so, we've neglected civic responsibility, civics and history. And people don't understand the historical connection of things, what has happened in history. And I thought all of us, I learned about African American and other history mostly when I went to Jackson State. I knew of some things from talking to my mom and other people, but I give them a pass, I think. We didn't talk about history so much because history was so painful. It was so hurtful. They were so proud of where we are. They didn't like where we were. And we did not talk about it much. We did not talk about some of the things that we saw, experienced, and all that. But I think if we had if people had a sense of what historically, what is it about this flag versus that flag, what was happening and when it was happening, I think all of us would be more tolerant to each other about how we talk about whether the symbol remains taken or is taken down or preserved in some other way. And again, what better place to talk about it and discuss it than on a university campus? And students should not be criticized and talked down to as being just emotional zombies or beasts. And I mean, because you are the next generation. And we have to understand that you are the ones in whose hands we're leaving this state or we giving it over to. And so you are part of this Mississippi dream that I envision more than anybody else. So if that answers your question, just continue the talk, just continue the discussion, just continue the information gathering, the learning, and being receptive to hearing what the other side says, but say, okay, I understand you, but let's look at it from this perspective. Let's talk about how it might be offensive to someone. Let's talk about that. You know, let's talk about the debate of whether, you know, to the victor belongs the spoils. But in this instance, the victor says, well, the spoiler says, you may be victorious, but you need to keep our flag. I mean, you know, be receptive to thought and conversation. That is so important for all of us.
We have time for one more. If there isn't one, I'll just ask you if you would give us your thoughts about whether or not we have reason to hope with regard to the future of Mississippi on race and moral issues.
I think so. Because this generation of kids have been through, yes, I think I'm reflective of that. I really do. The notion, again, there was a time when black people could not be seen with white people. By law, could not touch white people, could not do this, could not, you know, again, looking at history and understanding of the legal mechanisms that were used to keep the races separate. And at this time, you know, you can look around and you see the University of Mississippi having 18% or 20 or whatever minority students. You woke up in 1975, you never thought that would be. You never thought anybody would want it to be. So you have these relationships. You get to know each other, you get to work with each other, you get to respect each other, you get to understand each other, and you'll see that there is hope in this Mississippi. There can't be nothing but hope, I think. And I think, yeah, Mississippi is turning the fact that these young men had come to my court for this type of crime was a shock to everybody. That in itself says a lot. It was shocking. It was horrible. It was horrendous for some people, for many people. It was horrendous. It was, how dare they? And these were the voices of white Mississippians, because they don't want to be taken back, I don't think, to that era. And they have learned that Mississippi is a much better place when all of us are working together. And to the African Americans and Native Americans, we now ought to be welcoming with open arms. All the Hispanics, because their numbers are increasing, and we should not force on them the things that were forced on us. Vietnamese Americans down there on the coast, there's a burgeoning crowd of them. And we have to understand that they have a right to claim Mississippi just like all of us have claimed Mississippi. Mississippi is big enough for all of us. There's 82 counties. You come to Yazoo County, it's the largest county and the most populous county, but it's the largest. You come there, Mississippi belongs to each one of us, and we can claim our plot of Mississippi. And we can make that plot the best plot. And if all of us are making our plots of Mississippi better, Mississippi is going to be great. Mississippi is going to be better, Mississippi is going to be great, and then Mississippi is going to be the best. And I think it's because of the rich diversity that the state has in culture and in everything else, has a rich diversity. And when we talk, when we break bread, when we share this discussion with each other, and as we move forward, I think it's going to make Mississippi the best place that Mississippi be the apple in everyone's eye, and all the other 49 states and the District of Columbia could be jealous of the Mississippi.
On that note, let's thank Judge Reeves.